Welcome to a special edition of JMC Live. I am your host, Jeremy Caverley. We normally have a show every Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern. Today we have Mr. Alan Davis. His background covers over 30 years of management experience. He's been a CFO, a director involving various financial analyst work. He has histories working at health departments. Looking through his other resume and credentials, he has a master's degree at University of Houston, a bachelor's degree at University of Kansas, and his certifications are in public accounting and management care. There are a lot of reasons why we have Mr. Davis on the show today. One is he's a Christian. Two, is his background not only in the financial sector, but the fact that he is a conservative and he wants to bring about a change and to expose a truth that some common people may not understand. And he can bring the message of financial security, financial balancing, understanding budgets in a way that someone that has a college degree can understand, or someone who's just, your average mom or your average friend. He wants to share a message with us today about what's going on in our government, what's not being told, what is being told, what is the truth, and where can we go from there? And now we have with us Mr. Alan Davis. I'd like to thank you for coming today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Jeremy.
No problem.
This is the first time I've ever spoken out in this way, though I've been pretty active for the last 15 years. The main purpose of what I've been doing is back in 1996, I started watching C-SPAN, and I noticed that some in our government were using some pretty outrageous and false claims to help win re-election. And I said, wait a second, voters should have the right to cast informed votes and then vote however they want. So I've been pretty active just trying to understand more about our government, more about our our nation's finances, and track the truthfulness of what people have said ever since. I've spent way too much time doing it and way too much money. I've spent thousands of hours over that 15 years and tens of thousands of dollars writing letters and building databases and just learning as much as I could. There have been times during that where I've felt that this is a mission that God has for me in my life, and where I really bring purpose to my life and to his Christian community. But the other times I've wondered, am I just fooling myself, and am I just living in a fantasy world? Because it seems like all I've done, there's been nothing come out of it. I think now I've become more convinced that God prepared me. He created persistence and patience, and now may be the time that He's ready to use me. I think that my emailing you as a college Republican at OUC when there almost wasn't such a thing, and you responding back was part of God's plan to say, okay, now's time. And so I'm willing to speak up and act on that.
Well, one of the things that I know a lot of listeners are interested about is the topics that you choose to write about. And how do you feel about what you pick, and what are the different responses that you get? How do you choose what to write about? Because there's so many things going on. Where do you start from?
Usually it has something to do with where I believe I have a background to be able to address it appropriately, and where I think that the general knowledge is contrary to what I believe is really true. So it usually does have something to do with spending, program trends, or just weird things like I happen to turn on maybe Meet the Press rather than maybe that Sunday I didn't go to church and I hear one of our politicians say something that I know is pretty outrageous and false, and then I said, well, wait a second, people need to know that what they're saying isn't true. Other things are just based on my background. So like the big topic that I'm writing on right now and looking into over the last couple of weeks has been the new 2012 budget. There's a lot of focus on that. People are worried about our future, concerned about the amount of debt we are building, and so I want to make sure they understand what some of the things that go into that, and the implications of that. Because in my opinion, and from my background and my analysis, as bad as that $7.2 trillion of additional national debt over the next 10 years is, that they've purposely understated that dramatically by using unreasonably low assumptions. And so that's one of the things that I'm concentrating on right now, is trying to get people to understand how bad those assumptions are and how much worse the situation would look if they had used reasonable assumptions.
Yeah, I'm looking at the statistics you have given me here, and I'm seeing inflation it's just too consistent of the same numbers. And then I'm looking at the fluctuations of CPI and the averaging, anywhere from 2.9 all the way up to 11, depending on the year. And I'm looking at the current and the projected rates.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why they think.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
they have
much
this
sense
year
to me.
in the budget, and so they just released the budget. They have the inflation rate for 2011.
Yeah.
Now again, people need to remember, our federal budget is not calendar year.
Mm-hmm.
It starts October 1st and goes to September 30th. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the period of time that we're looking at when we talk about the budget with the
Exactly.
federal. We've experienced some of those months already.
Mm-hmm.
And they have in the 2011 budget that inflation will be 1.3%. Well, when I went out and looked, and all the stuff's out on the web, so you can Google CPI, and there'll be a government website, and look for the historical numbers, and you can see what the CPI has been each year since like 1913, but I don't remember the exact start date because I usually concentrate on more recent stuff. And you can look to see how has it changed since September 30th of last year. Well, the last number that they had posted was January, and we had basically had already enough inflation since September 30th that we're already at 1.3%, and yet we have 8 more months to go. So how is 1.3 a reasonable inflation rate for this year? Well, it's not. And I think that most economists, including the chief economist at the White House, should have known that. I can't understand why they would include that number. And then, like you mentioned, what they've done is they've slowly increased that to the point where they get a maximum of 2.1%. Now, without being real technical, the 2.1% is the target rate for the Fed. Well, if you go back and look, how often have we hit the target rate for the Fed? Almost never. And about the only times we hit that is when we're in recession. So why would you use the target rate if we never hit it as the rate to build the budget numbers off of? Now, I don't know. Some people might say, well, it's purposeful to keep those numbers low because inflation over time will build, and later year numbers will look lower than they should. Mm-hmm. Some maybe it's a mistake, or maybe they have some kind of special thought process on how they're going to do it. But if we haven't been able to have a decade like that in the last 50 years, what's the likelihood of the next decade looking like that? I think most reasonable, logical thinking people would say pretty highly unlikely. And when my background, I've done loads and loads of budgets for most of my career in healthcare. Matter of fact, the very first job I ever had to do, when I got hired at my first hospital, was recalculate a budget. That was the first thing I started. So I've been doing them for 30 plus years. And so typically what you want to do is make sure your high-level assumptions are reasonable. Mm-hmm. And if you've done that, then most of the rest of the budget will look good, or should look good. And so that's why in the past 3 years when I've looked at these budgets, I immediately go to those high-level assumptions.
If we look through the last few years of spending, I keep seeing that they raise the bar, the price ceiling of what the budget's going to be. If you look in history, the government actually shut down in 1991. things still got paid, Social Security, everything still got paid, but the balanced budget was not happening. And now we look at the projected future and current, everything is just not lining up for me because the numbers, it's almost like they have this high level of allowance of doubtful accounts or something, saying, well, we're just going to not worry about the $2 trillion we owe and the fact that Saudi Arabia and other countries own 20% of our debt. We'll just finance our debt to another country and give them more of a rate and not tax them so much so they'll take on our debt. And then you look in the economists recently, they're saying that the value of the dollar is going to drop more. There's all this Middle East crisis stuff going on, and China's GDP is kicking up, and they're looking at possibly becoming a shareholder of the international currency. So I don't understand how the government can sit there and say, we're going to balance the budget. If you look also in the last 2 or 3 years, states started borrowing more money, and the government was borrowing more money from other countries. Countries were getting bailed out. Now we got states like Wisconsin and Ohio trying to balance their budget, getting yelled at over things about teaching and everything else. It's getting out of control. There's no more money to borrow from anyone. So when's the time going to come to actually pay off our dues? That's the big thing. And what I like about you is you actually show in these charts how it's so unrealistic. You know, if you were a business owner and you had this kind of a budget, you would be fired from your position.
Yeah, if I had done a budget like this, and again, you know, if I had done it 3 years in a row, then I would no longer be employed, and that would be a part of my resume, and the question would be, why would anyone employ me if I did that poorly on projecting what's going to happen in the future? Mm-hmm. It's always tough to know what's going to happen in the future, but that's why reasonable people would say, well, let's do more than one projection. Let's have a projection if things go really well. Let's have a projection if they go as we think they would, and let's have a projection that they would go if they go poorly. And then you say, we have a range that we can manage within. Well, what I see they've done on this is not only with the inflation number, but also the interest rates and the unemployment and the growth rate. They've taken almost the most optimistic numbers that they could get away with in all 5 of those categories and use them, which would be that overly optimistic projection that I talked about. Well, where is the reasonably expected projection, and what happens if things don't go well projection and we don't get to see them? Now, on the national debt, we have a little over 14 trillion right now. And everyone talks about that as if, well, it's the Chinese that own it, or the Saudis own it all. But there's actually 2 aspects to our national debt. There's the amount that the public owns, and there's the part that we borrow from other government agencies. Mm-hmm. And the part that we borrow from other government agencies has grown also in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's almost $4.5 trillion. So some people out there say, well, let's just default on our debt and let the Chinese eat it. Well, when we default on our debt, are we going to be selective? Because the Social Security Trust Fund is part of that debt. And there's over $2.5 trillion, or approximately $2.5 trillion of our debt is owed back to the trust fund in IOUs. So if we default on our debt, we have no money to pay back those IOUs. Now, that public is also not just foreign entities. So organizations like our local health hospital, a lot of individuals buy government debt, treasury notes, as part of their retirement plans or investments. And so if we default on our debt, are we going to default and cause, it'll cause turmoil to those individuals and organizations too. Exactly. So there's a lot of implications to this whole situation. And the key concern I have is for us to make good decisions, we have to have good numbers. And if they are playing games with our inflation rate assumptions and the interest rate assumptions especially, then we don't have good numbers to make decisions on. Now, I've done some real rough. I mean, it's hard to get your handles around the budget, but with the size budget we have and the inflation rate numbers that they've used and the interest rate numbers they used, I'm guessing that that $7.2 trillion of increase, if we had a reasonable budget, not a worst case budget, but a reasonable budget assumption rather than this fantasy, I'd call it fantasy or best case scenario, that number would be closer to $15 trillion of increase in debt. And I know that they know that that would not be supported by anyone. And if we used a worst case, then it's probably more like 20 to 25 trillion that it would be showing in those out years. There's a concept that people may forget, and it's called compounding. And so what it says is if you have 2% in this year and 2% next year, well, that second year it's not at 2%, it's a little bit more. And then if you keep going out over 10 years, the compounding effect is quite substantial. Now, if you use a very low interest rate or inflation rate over all those years, then that compounding effect is pretty small. But as you start adding to that inflation rate assumption and use it over 10 years, it gets larger and larger. And just as an example, the 10th year, I did this and it's in one of the things I've given you. The 10th year factor in their budget would be 123 plus a little bit. Back in the 70s, when we had increasing oil prices, Middle East unrest, and increasing debt and increasing deficits, we had over 7% inflation for the decade, and the compounding effect was 238. So the difference between 238 and 123 is huge. Now, I'm not saying we're back in the 70s yet. If you listen to people like Len Beck, he believes very soon we will be. But even if you say, okay, he's overstating the situation, if you say, let's use 3% or 3.5% instead of, well, I did it at 4%, so maybe that's a little too high for the average, it would make about $900 billion difference in the amount of outlays in year 10 over what they're showing, which would increase the deficit by 900 trillion and then also increase the debt substantially. And then you say, well, if that one's off, well, then year 9 would have been off, year 8 would have been off, year 5, 7, 6, and that off. So the numbers get huge if you do it. I've taken, I can't control what happens in the universe. I can't control what our Congress people do, what media does, what the public does. I can only control what I do. So I've tried to go and say tried to educate me on the situation, learn as much as I can, then figure, using my God-given talents and my background, what looks reasonable to me. And I've started expressing my opinions. So I've sent numerous emails, probably ranging in the range of 400 or 500 over the last 2 weeks. I've sent dozens of letters. I've made phone calls and just saying. I've even called some Democrats who I think are honest people but just misled, and I said, you might want to watch out. It looks like they're using purposely understated assumptions, and if so, you're going to look pretty foolish if it turns out that those assumptions aren't realistic. And the latest thing I've done is I've written a letter to the president, and again, not accusatory, because the president's not an economist. Exactly. Just trying to point out what he might want to look at for and how the numbers in his budget may make him look foolish. And I want our president to look strong, good, and all. I'm not one of those that is out to badmouth our president. I also wrote one to the White House chief economist, and I sent it, and I sent it certified overnight mail. So today he's going to get that letter. What I'm trying now to do is some of the people that I know say, read that letter, do a little research yourself. If you think I understand things correctly, why don't you send a letter to the president or to Mr. Goolsbee and just say, hey, help us understand how a 2% inflation factor over 10 years is a good thing to do when we've never had that in the last 50 years. How are you going to accomplish that? So if you have any readers there, we might want to share that letter with them, and then they could say, and I've even suggested to a few people that I said, just tack a note on it, say, please help us understand, but please don't fool with my future. And for me, it's not my future, it's my grandkids' future, and your future, because you're a young man and you want to have a good future.
I'm looking at a statistics right now. It goes from 1980 to 2020, and then the left column goes up from 20% up to 90%. Just talking about the three entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. In the 80s, it's 26.1%. Then it gets up to about 50% in the mid 90s. That was around after the shutdown and the Gulf War and everything. But then 2000 to about 2005, it went back down, and it was averaged between 39.4%. But what's going on from 2008 all the way out to projected 2020, it's 90%. Currently, it's at 67.5. There's a video out there you can watch with pennies. Our budget is roughly around 67.5 you have to pay. And then we have this other 40-50%. And he's talking about the projections of inflation, which helps lower the cost of interest that's due and accrued on things that happen. The other side of the coin is if we print more money, it can change the factors of what's happening with what's owed and what's not. It makes your GDP look better. But all these things are almost kind of haphazardly, because you can only do that for so long. And the time comes when, the fat lady's going to sing, as they say. It's like, hey, my money, I want my money. If you look at what happened with the banks the first time when they failed, people stormed the banks. They're like, I want my money. And we've bailed out large companies. We've bailed out other things. Now states are wanting bailout. Teachers are wanting bailout. Everyone's wanting money that's not coming anymore unless, some kind of weird, catastrophic, international thing happens. But
yeah, and most of the things that might happen are not on the positive side, they're on the negative side. So again, when I look at the projection for this year, and there's multiple people that do projections, so they have the Congressional Budget Office, and they're theoretically independent and not partisan. They're not supposed to be Democratic and promote their thought process, not supposed to be Republican. They're supposed to be the people's advocate and look for reasonable stuff. So they put out that this year, in real round numbers, they're expecting that we'll have $3.8 trillion in revenue, in expenses, and $2.2 trillion in revenue. So when you look at that difference, it's $1.6 trillion. And you start saying, okay, that's a big, big number. So even if we have some good growth in revenue, which is taxes, and then we have some cut back, there's still a huge difference. How do we solve that $1.6 trillion? Now, so it's a very complicated situation, and but the way Washington now seems to be solving it is coming up with new terms. So if you listen to what they say, they've now invented two new terms that I don't ever remember hearing when I was young. The first is they only refer to public debt. So even the Congressional Budget Office, which is supposed to be independent and helping us watch out for ourselves, in their last projections, they only showed public debt. They didn't show that debt that the government owes to itself, which is getting bigger. So they're now talking about public debt as percent of GDP, and they're talking about public debt as percent of, and those kinds of things. And they say, well, what happens to that non-public debt? By talking about public debt, it doesn't look as good as talking about total debt. So that's one of these new terms they've invented and started to use to make us not panic.
Yeah. So
The
you're not
other
looking
one-
at the whole.
The other one is even more deceitful to me than just talking about public debt. They've now started talking about primary deficit. And you say, okay, what the heck? I mean, deficit's deficit. What is primary deficit? Well, the term that they have used and invented is the deficit before interest. You say, okay, well, isn't that sort of like me talking about my budget and saying my primary budget doesn't include my mortgage payment? And, oh, I'm going to balance my primary budget, and my mortgage company is going to say, that's fine, but you're not paying your mortgage, and you can't afford it doing that, and therefore you're not going to have a house anymore. So, wait a second. If primary deficit, if their goal is to balance primary deficit, and that includes net interest, isn't that a bad thing? Now, I would say, most people would say, yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, most people don't realize that right now we pay very, very little interest on our debt. Because we're in a period that they're trying to prompt economic growth, they have slashed the Federal Reserve rate. And if you go out to the Federal Reserve Board site, which I'm a website, and I know why would anyone do it but Alan Davis, but I do it every month or two, and you look and you can download either daily, weekly, monthly, or annual interest rates trends. And going way back, and it depends on how far back. Some of them are back to the 50s, some to the 60s, some later, because some of the different length or maturities on debt they've used at different times in our history. But the basic ones, the real short ones, and the 10-year they've used for a long time. If you go back and look at those, you can see what's the trends on those, and you'll find that we're oh, okay. If you go back and look, you'll find we are at the lowest level we've ever been for the Fed rate. What does that do? That lowers short-term interest rates. Mm-hmm. So the 91-day notes and those kinds of things are real, real low right now. So what they've done is they've financed a lot of our debt with these short-term treasuries at a very low interest rate. That's why, if you look back at 2010, we had $187 billion worth of interest, which is quite a bit. But if you look back in the 90s, we averaged over $200 billion on about 1/3 of the national debt. So once the Fed rate goes back up to normal and interest rates, short-term rates, go back to normal, we can expect to have about a tripling in our interest that we pay on our debt, even without more debt. And then if inflation rises and interest rates rise because of it, then it'll get even worse. And with their projections of how much debt we're going to add, it's even worse than what they show. And if you go back, and again, why would anyone do it other than me? I went back and I looked and I said, how high has the Fed rate gotten? Well, and it's the lowest term rates. In the 70s, when we had runaway inflation because of runaway spending and increasing deficits and debt, they had to raise the Fed fund rate to 19.9% in the summer of 1981. Now that drove everyone's interest rates up. So most young people are not old enough to remember those times when you almost couldn't afford a house because the interest rates were so high. You certainly wouldn't charge anything on your credit card, and to buy a car became difficult. Now I'm not saying we're going to get back to those rates, but they are using the fact that the Fed fund rate is extremely low to finance our debt much cheaper than what normal rates would have. Once they go to normal, we'll automatically see a large increase in the interest expense that they haven't even fully factored into their projections.
All right, Mr. Davis, we're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to JMC Live. I'm your host, Jeremy Caverley. We still have with us Alan Davis. We've been discussing about inflation rates, the assumptions, the future rates that are going to happen, and current rates in the financial sector known as the U.S. government. When this topic is brought up, it normally brings up controversy, anger, confusion, or I don't care. And what we're trying to do today, and what we'll be doing with Mr. Davis, more interviews later, is to give everyone an opportunity to have information present to you, so you have an opportunity to make a choice on what you want to do about this. You can listen to this and be bored out of your mind, because I know most people don't understand statistics and finance and accounting. There's like 1 to 5% of Americans who can sit here and read a financial statement and make sense to them. So I want to try and make a balance so everyone will understand. A good example for the younger generation is the game SimCity, or even Farmville for even the younger crowd. It's kind of a similar thing. You're wanting to create something. At the same point, you have a barter system, trading system. And I remember I would play SimCity as a child. I'm 30 years of age now. And I would raise the interest in the percentage for taxes, like 12% in the beginning, because I didn't have any money. And we would bring money in, and I'd have a projected rate every 5 years. I would lower it by 2%, till we got down to 4%, and it would just stay locked. Every time it would happen, things would be fine. They would want it 1% higher, 1% lower, and eventually it all worked out. Well, society does not work where you can say, oh yeah, you know, when you get paid, we're going to have 7% taxes, and that's the only tax that's going to happen, and it don't matter if you make $250K or $1.50. Society, the way it is, and our tax system and everything, you pay taxes again later, and then in the beginning, and things go change, and it's just confusing to some people. So today, I want to challenge you, and Mr. Davis will be challenging you too, to learn how to write your congressman, learn how to get a hold of your local offices. He's running for city council here in Chillicothe. And what are these positions? What is this about? What does this have to do with little old me? Well, your Social Security, your Medicare, the amount of taxes you pay, all these things revolve around decisions that start in your local government offices, to your state government offices, and then to the federal government, and then to the whole world, because we're all interconnected now. You can't just do one thing without someone else finding out about it. So without further ado, we're going to go back to Mr. Davis.
Appreciate that. You're about the same age as some of my kids, so I remember watching them play SimCity. I remember thinking, boy, I wish we had computers when I was growing up, because then I probably wouldn't have ever got my college degree. I would have spent my whole time playing SimCity or war games that I like to play or stuff like that.
You would have created Atari. That's what you would have been.
But yeah, and the situation that we deal with, I understand that some of the topics are a little confusing. And what makes it especially confusing for people is that not all the things that are said are factual. And that's how I got started. I heard some things that weren't factual being said in a campaign, and I said, wait a second, people need to know the truth about that, and that got me started. That got me started way back in 1996, and I've been interested ever since, and over that time, certain topics have been of interest to me, so I've researched and put together stuff. So I'd be glad at some future date come and talk about federal income tax, because there's a lot of misstatements on federal income tax. Mm-hmm. Recently I've heard Alan Combs on the O'Reilly factor say, well, the wealthy are paying the lowest income tax rate in history. And I said, well, how could that be, since we never had a federal income tax on individuals' incomes prior to 1913? So I think that Alan Combs has been saying a few naughty things. He's misleading people. Also, the very first year, but we could talk about income tax in a lot more detail later, but I happen to have a copy of the first income tax return. And back then, the top rate was 7% over all income over $500,000. Well, $500,000 in 1913 is the equivalent, I think, but I can double check this, of about $10 million now. So if the wealthy are paying the lowest that they've ever paid, how are they paying less than 7% now? No, the top rate's dramatically higher than that. So again, my whole focus has been, and over my time, is let people be informed and then cast their vote however they want. If they want to vote for a Democrat because their dad was a Democrat and they think Democrats are better, that's fine. But don't do it because they've heard something from a Democrat that may not be true. Same thing on a Republican. My grandparents were Republicans. They told me in college, vote Republican. Well, I don't vote just because my grandparents told me, but I believe in the principles that they believed in, so I vote Republican. But I should vote Republican because of things I know to be true, not if they are telling me falsehoods. And that's what I'm all about. And that's why, getting back to the 2012 budget, why I'm so concerned, and I've taken it on myself to start writing, emailing, and phoning all kinds of different people. I've emailed the Federal Reserve Board, and I gave you copies of their responses. So they're on record. They know that someone out there knows that the inflation rate that's being used is the Fed fund rate, which is 2.1, and we've never experienced that for a decade. So why is that being used? I've written to the White House top economist, and who is recognized as a world-leading economist. I would assume he reviewed the inflation assumptions and other assumptions used in the budget. Well, if he did he say, yeah, those look good, or did he say, if you don't use those, the budget won't be accepted by anyone? I don't know. But I've written to him, and I've written to my Congress people and all. So, I would hope out of this, people would go to the websites. You can go to the White House website, look for Office of Management and Budget, and then you can download their summary schedules out of the budget, and look for page page 202, table S13, and look and see, does it look like the maximum inflation rate? And they call inflation their consumer price index, percent increase year to year. They have these fancy terms to hide what it is. But is the maximum rate 2.1, like I said? If it is, and would it average out about 2% looking across the deal? And if it does, then you might say, whoa, I guess Alan Davis was telling me the truth. And then you can go Google CPI and look for the historic table and look there and see how many years have we been at 2.1 or less. And am I telling the truth? If I'm telling the truth, and most of the years are substantially higher, then you might want to write to the president and say, what's going on? How come your budget has such low rates in it? Because we need to have good numbers, good information to make informed decisions. And politics should not be, and government should not be, two sides lying to us to convince us their side is right. They should be presenting facts to convince us their side is right.
All right, Mr. Davis, I'd like to thank you for coming today, and I want to know how people can get a hold of you and what is the next step for you.
Well, I hope someday I'll maybe have a website and blog up where I can share these things and some of the data that I've created, some of the databases. I don't know if that'll happen. If they want to get in touch with me, I mean, I'm not a real public person, but I do have an email address that I use for my political stuff, and it's stopthemadness01@gmail.com, and hopefully Google's not intercepting emails, and I'd get an email, and I'd be glad to respond back to them. I would be glad to share some of the files I have and stuff like that, and then certainly at some point in time I hope to be back and we can talk about some other subjects, maybe about income tax or other things that there's a lot of misconception out there.
Well, that was stopthemadness@gmail.com, and we here at
Stop the Madness 01.
01. Let me get that corrected. StopTheMadness01@gmail.com.
And it's 01. I'm sorry, 01.
01.
Yeah.
0and1@gmail.com. And in the future, we're going to actually work with Mr. Davis and partner with him. So the websites and the letters and things that he has, we'll be getting those posted online here shortly. So he will have another voice online for people to be able to get a hold of. So we'll see you in the future.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
All right, thank you much.